So today, back again to focus on all things protein. I've been, I think, sitting back and watching this conversation play out, particularly on social media and other podcasts recently. And despite probably more episodes than ever across different shows being dedicated to protein, I think people are potentially more confused than ever. And there is at least from my view, there seems to be a conundrum that is presented for people to think about on an individual level. And that is that we hear from experts like Dr. Peter Attia or Dr. Gabrielle Lyon and others that the optimal amount of protein intake is actually like 2 grams per kilogram of body weight, or even maybe 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight, which is that old 1 gram per pound calculation. And attached to that same recommendation is usually the idea that animal protein is superior to plant protein. And in this conversation, we can chat about what does superior mean, and is animal protein superior? But the conundrum that the individual is faced with is that then people are exposed to these conversations where they're told that when we look at chronic disease outcomes, long-term health, that plant protein is actually advantageous. And then, of course, recommendations from government guidelines and scientists interested in planetary health that downshifting on animal protein and increasing our consumption of plant protein is better for the planet. So at an individual level, if you're just, before we even get into the science, if you're just exposed to those different conversations, the conundrum is, okay, am I going to eat more animal protein to optimize for muscle-related outcomes at the expense of my long-term health and at the expense of the health of the planet, of which we know we all rely on for our own individual health? Or do I optimize for chronic disease, reduce my risk of, say, cardiovascular disease and cancer and dementia, and eat in a way that's planetary friendly at the expense of muscle-related outcomes and potentially being more frail? I don't know. Do you agree that that is potentially a place that a lot of people kind of fall and become confused about what they should be buying at the grocery store?
I think you're right in that those are two possible, like, contrasting ideas out there. But I also think when you talk about the Atias and the Lions and all of those individuals, they sort of frame it as though packing on more muscle then leads to those better long-term outcomes, and they tend to emphasize animal protein. So I feel like the narrative, while I think the evidence is clear that plant protein is superior to animal protein when it comes to health outcomes, they sort of frame it as though, well, animal protein promotes better muscle gains and therefore leads to better health outcomes. So I don't know that people who are following their message are necessarily being met with that dichotomy.
And I don't really think that they spend a lot of time talking about observational population studies looking at health outcomes. And that'll probably be something that we get to as to, like, how are they treating that evidence and why is that not part of the conversation?
Well, I think they are, but in different contexts, like with exercise and whatnot, which we can definitely dive into. So they do tend to, in certain contexts or for certain types of interventions, but when it comes to this animal plant protein debate, they seem to disregard a lot of that evidence.
If we were to break all of this down, I think the helpful kind of roadmap would be to think about 5 questions, and I've written them down here. The first being, how much protein is optimal for building muscle, for increasing strength, and for preventing sarcopenia, so muscle loss and strength loss and function loss as we age. The second question is animal protein superior to plant protein for building muscle and strength? The third is plant protein better for healthy aging and chronic disease risk? So if we or others are going to make that claim, what is that based on? The fourth is a low or high protein diet better for longevity and disease prevention? Because you will hear pretty strong views out there that we should be restricting protein, in fact. which is separate to where are you getting your protein. It comes back to how much protein are we consuming. And then the fifth is plant protein better for the environment? And if we step through those 5 questions, I think that will give people greater confidence with making these decisions at the individual level. So let's start with how much protein do we actually need to build and maintain muscle as we age? When you think about that question, how do you go about reviewing and summarizing the evidence base that we have?
So a lot of people will mention things like this term muscle protein synthesis, which is sort of this action of putting protein into muscle or building muscle that can be measured in certain ways. You'll have people talking about the availability of amino acids in your bloodstream after consuming protein. But what I like to look at is what we're ultimately talking about here. How does the protein intake actually impact muscle gains or strength gains? And so we have plenty of randomized controlled trials now where one group will be consuming a lower protein diet and another group will be consuming a higher protein diet. Now, one of the most famous meta-analyses on this, it was done by Morton et al. And a previous guest of yours, Stu Phillips, was on that paper as well. And they found that as you increase protein intake when paired with resistance training, the sort of break point or the point where that curve flattens out is around 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, or that's roughly 0.75 grams per pound of body weight. Now, there was a lot of variability in the results of the trials that were included there, and some of the trials do look like there was maybe differences in calorie intake or weight gain between groups. So it's a little bit messy in some ways. But following that, there was a meta-analysis just a few years ago by Tagawa and colleagues. And they did a really good job excluding studies where there were differences in weight gain or weight loss. And they had a much more narrow range of results, so it wasn't quite as varied. And they found, at least for strength outcomes, that if you pair protein at 1.5 grams per kilogram of body weight with resistance training, that's sort of the peak. And beyond that doesn't lead to further benefit, at least for strength outcomes.
And in that paper, from memory, the majority of the strength was achieved at a protein intake around 1.2 grams. It certainly went up to 1.5, a little bit more, but most of it, the steepest part of that curve, was achieved from very low protein intake to about 1.2.
Well, I think that's pretty consistent across the data as well. Like, I think that's something that gets left out a lot, is that, and I know Stu Phillips has used this example, I know you've used this example, where you think of it as sort of wringing out a wet towel. You get most of it by those few initial kind of rings, but once you get to the last little bit, you're really just squeezing the last few drops out. That's sort of the difference between like 1.2 grams per kilogram and 1.6 grams per kilogram. So, if you're somebody looking to maximize muscle and strength gains, yeah, 1.6 or 1.5 is an excellent target. But for the general public, do you need to go that far necessarily for what are ultimately modest additional gains? Probably not, but I think that's an individual decision to make. And also, actually, on the Tagawa paper, something I'll mention is in those studies where there wasn't resistance training, so where they just jacked up protein but didn't have people lifting weights or doing body weight exercises, there was next to nothing. So protein itself doesn't seem to really promote muscle. You need to actually work for it as well.
That seemed to also be something that Stuart Phillips was involved in the 2022 meta-analysis of looking at this exact question, where they looked at protein and body composition as well as strength in adults under 65 and over 65. And one of the comments that they made a few times in there was that as you increase protein, the effect is very, very small on muscle mass across the board relative to resistance training. And I think that gets lost in these conversations, like the conversation that Peter Attia had recently with Rhonda Patrick, where there's all of this emphasis on consuming two plus grams of protein per kilogram. Why do you think that Peter has that recommendation of kind of consuming well north of these numbers that we're seeing in these studies?
So I don't know exactly where he's gotten that idea, but I know a few places that tends to come from. So if we go back to that Morton meta-analysis I talked about earlier, like I said, there was a lot of variability in the results. And if you were to be, let's say, generous and take the highest end, those particular studies where they saw benefit with the highest protein intake, there were some studies suggesting going up to like 2 or 2.2 grams per kilogram could potentially be superior. However, as I mentioned, there are differences in calorie intake between some of them. There are some differences in weight gain between some of them. So there are some issues there. At the same time, we also know that if you are in a calorie deficit, so if you're trying to lose weight but hold on to muscle, actually going higher with protein to that range of 2.2, maybe even 2.5 grams per kilogram could be helpful. But again, that's a very specific context. So maybe that's where he's getting it from, but it doesn't make sense to use that for the general public.
I'm going to read out an email that Stuart sent me today.
Okay.
Because I think he might even push back on that.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, and I think that was perhaps Stuart Phillips, perhaps that was a view of his previously around maybe increasing protein intake if you're in a calorie restricted state. He says, and I asked him, I said, is there any evidence that consuming 1.6 grams per kilogram is significantly better than 1.2 grams? So not comparing 1.6 to like 0.8, which are the guidelines, but comparing it to 1.2, which is closer to where people are actually landing naturally in Western populations. And he says, Simon, strongly no, but evidence there is attached. The degree of debate over 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein, however, amounts to an additional 15 to 25 grams of protein per day, depending on body weight. Scorched earth nuance, in my opinion. What is very clear, at least to me, is that it is ridiculous to be consuming 2.2 grams per kilogram or 1 gram per pound or more. There is no evidence to support this, even in energy-restricted states and even for muscle.
Wow. Okay. There you have it.
So pretty strong position. And it was a little counterintuitive to me that in that meta-analysis where they looked at the optimal amount of protein consumption to support muscle mass body composition in adults over 65 and under, the optimal amount for young adults was at 1.6 grams per kilogram or greater. So that level that we see in the Morton analysis. But for older adults, it was actually lower than that. It was between 1.2 and 1.59. Despite, I guess, a general kind of consensus view out there being that as we age, we develop anabolic resistance. And I had thought that if anything, elderly would require more protein.
Yeah, that is the common thought. But what's really interesting is if you look at the trials on elderly and protein intake, they don't tend to be all that convincing of, these super high protein intakes being beneficial. Why that is, I'm not entirely clear because, as you suggested, even moderately increasing to that like 1.2 range or so seems to be beneficial, but perhaps it has to do with minimizing intakes of other important nutrients. Perhaps it's a diet quality issue. It's just not super clear.
And so if we take that 1.2 to say 1.6 gram kind of range, maybe the upper end of that, if you are a young adult and really striving to build muscle, if you look at a 70 kilogram person, just to make this super practical, 1.2 grams per kilogram is 84 grams of protein a day. And 1.6 is 112 grams of protein per day. So to Stuart's point, like that's approximately a 30 gram difference, depending on whether you're targeting the bottom end of that range or the top end. But both of those numbers being 84 grams of protein a day or 112 is substantially less than those recommendations from PETA that are at 2 grams of protein per kilogram per day, with really a strong kind of bias towards animal protein. It seems like an unscientific position to take.
Yeah, I would just like to see what evidence he would cite for that. I've listened to some of the same sort of podcast episodes that you have on this, and I hear those claims a lot, but I never really see good evidence supporting it unless someone is taking, say, the Morton meta-analysis and just picking the highest values they can out of that. So, yeah, I would just ask for the evidence.
I think his point, now that I recall that latest conversation, was that what's the harm? Show me the evidence that there is harm. And that, to me, unless you're willing and open to look at the observational epidemiology, which I'm not sure that he is, it's a hard question to answer.
Yeah, and I'd also say that there's potential harm just in the sense that that would actually take a lot of effort. Like the amount of energy and effort that would have to be put into consuming that amount is a whole lot more than say 1.2 or 1.3 grams per kilogram or something along those lines. And then also we have to consider source, which I know we'll get to, but if you're really emphasizing a lot of the red meats and those types of things, well then that's potentially problematic as well.
But the take home point there being that the strongest evidence that we have doesn't really support this idea of once you're going up above 1.6 grams per kilogram, doesn't support the idea that that is in any way contributing to more muscle mass or strength. Yeah, at least it's not detectable in the studies that we have that have been repeated over and over and over.
Yeah.
Let's talk about protein source.
What matters is the amount of protein. The source seems to play little, if any, role, provided that you're having some level of a variety. If we were to repeat the same studies where you're getting all your protein from a single plant source, could you maybe make an argument that that might be suboptimal? Sure. But as long as you're having some level of variety and hitting around that range of, 1.2 or so, that's pretty good. And of course, if you're looking to absolutely maximize muscle and strength, going higher to 1.6 is reasonable, but beyond that, it seems to be no further benefit.
Have you guys ever tried creatine gummies? I have. And in fact, for a while there between you and I, they were a secret vice of mine. Damn, they tasted good. Problem was, like many creatine gummy brands, while they taste good, they contain very little, if any, creatine at all. A lot of brands that have been selling these creatine gummies over the years have been knowingly or unknowingly duping us. So I've been waiting for a brand to bring out creatine chews that are actually legit. And Momentous stepped up to the plate big time. The all new Momentous creatine chews deliver exactly 1 gram of CreaPure creatine monohydrate, which is the gold standard form, single sourced from Germany and NSF certified for sport, meaning that every single batch is independently tested for purity, for safety, and for label accuracy. There's no artificial sweeteners, no fillers, just science-backed, clinically proven performance in a portable, craveable format. And right now, Momentous is offering our listeners up to 35% off your first order with promo code THEPROOF. Go to livemomentous.com and use promo code THEPROOF for up to 35% off your first order. That's livemomentous.com, promo code THEPROOF. So the next thing that comes up in this discussion related to muscle. So let's stay focused on muscle related outcomes here for a moment. Is okay, well, we have these guidelines, 1.6 grams per kilogram for the athlete and the person really trying to optimize 1.2 to 1.6 grams for everyone else. But does where that protein's coming from affect strength, affect the building of muscle mass because of things like protein absorption and utilization differences specifically between foods that contain animal protein and foods that contain plant protein? So where do you begin in terms of looking at the evidence to help answer that question?
Well, a lot of people will cite studies on, again, muscle protein synthesis, as we've talked about. Some people will point out the amino acid profiles of different foods. I would go straight to the trials actually assessing, again, muscle and strength gains, because that's the topic at hand here. If it is the case that animal protein and plant protein result in the same muscle and strength gains, provided you're consuming the same amount, then who cares about all that other stuff? Now, for the sake of this discussion, we can definitely dive into that information and kind of break it down further. But if we were to go straight to those randomized controlled trials to start here, we have clinical trials, because they were not randomized, and I'll get to that in a moment. But 2 clinical trials that we have. So one of them was a Brazilian study done by Hamilton Rochelle and Javier Lorraine and colleagues. And in this study, they had 19 vegans and 19 meat eaters. Now, the reason it wasn't randomized was because they wanted people who regularly consumed those diets. It's a bit more of a challenge if you were to take a regular meat eater and then place them on a vegan diet and have them match protein, because they're trying new foods. They aren't used to these plant foods, how to prepare them. They might not know what seitan or maybe haven't prepared tofu and all of that. So they had 19 of each. They had them up their protein to 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight, either exclusively from plants or mostly from animals. And they had them resistance training twice a week for 12 weeks. And then they measured the changes in strength and muscle gains from the beginning to the end, and there were no significant differences between groups. And so that suggests that both can support similar performance or similar improvements. Now, following that, there was another study out of the UK by Montaigne and colleagues where they actually did randomize most people. Now, this is one nitpick I have for this study. I wish they would have excluded people that they didn't randomize. So they randomized most people to either a vegan or omnivorous diet, but they had one or two people who were already vegetarian or vegan. So they put them in that group rather than
And this one was men and women.
Yes. Yeah, the first one was men. So they had them up their protein, now aiming for 2 grams per kilogram, not because they think that that was necessary, but so that they have a buffer because they ended up consuming more like 1.8 or so. So still above that 1.6. They also had both groups consume creatine because that can also further bolster gains. And they had them training a lot more, this time 5 times a week for 10 weeks. And once again, no differences in muscle or strength gains. And one of the primary protein sources was mycoprotein. So this is a mycelium. Is sort of a type of fungi that's really high in protein and is sometimes used in like meat alternatives. And so those two trials show that actually there are no clear significant differences in muscle and strength gains as long as you're consuming the same amount of protein. And that's ultimately what matters. And we can get into the nitty gritty of, again, those other details I mentioned, but that's the end result.
And just to give people a little bit of an overview of, I guess, the history coming into those papers. There have been, over the years, a bunch of studies that have compared an isolated animal protein to an isolated plant protein, and then just looked at muscle protein synthesis in the kind of post-meal period. And a lot of those studies did point to the animal protein being more anabolic. So I think, generally speaking, I'm not sure if you would agree with this, but at least from what I've read, the hypothesis going in from a lot of people was that the omnivorous diet, where 60% of proteins coming from animal, would probably lead to better muscle and strength outcomes.
That would be the hypothesis from those acute MPS studies.
From those acute studies. Yeah. But those two studies came out. Plus, there's now studies looking at muscle protein synthesis, not only in the acute post-meal period, but daily muscle protein synthesis. And the one that's coming to mind first here is a study from Nicholas Bird that you and I were speaking about. And the reason I want to go here first is that this came out this year, and that was also healthy adults. So that was a kind of young adult population. And the reason it's interesting is because the two studies that you mentioned, they were pretty high protein.
Yeah.
Like 1.6 and the other one was 2.
One of them was 1.6. One of them, they were aiming for 2, but they ended up hitting about 1.8.
1.8. But those are really high. So some people might see those and say, okay, so maybe there's no difference between plant and animal when you jack up protein that high. You overcome the differences in like amino acid profiles. So then Nicholas Bird and his group, they looked at a protein intake of 1.1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram. Again, that's more in line with just the general person. If you go and pluck someone, out of a random neighborhood in Los Angeles who's not tracking their protein, they probably land at 1.1, 1.2. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
And they were looking at not just this muscle protein synthesis signal straight after a meal, because over time we've realized that there are some issues with that, and maybe we want to double click on that, but looking at daily muscle protein synthesis. And they compared a vegan diet to an omnivorous diet. There was 2 different meal distributions.
Yeah. So there was 4 groups. There was 2 omnivorous groups and 2 vegan groups. And then one of each had an unbalanced sort of meal schedules, similar to what you might have in a standard diet, where low protein breakfast, moderate protein lunch, high protein dinner. And then they had the other groups, 5 meals, 20% of protein at each meal, so evenly distributed.
So they're kind of answering 2 questions. A, is there a difference between an omnivorous diet and a vegan diet when it comes to daily muscle protein synthesis at protein intakes which are just representative of normal people? And then second, does the distribution of that protein matter? If it's if it again is in line with how people normally eat, where they're stacking protein at dinner, is that disadvantageous compared to like this even distribution that perhaps is a bit more of a bodybuilder style way of eating. And over that 9-day study measuring daily muscle protein synthesis and taking muscle biopsies, again, no significant differences between the two groups.
Between all four groups.
Between all four groups.
Between all four. And they also were resistance training throughout that time. I don't know if you mentioned there, so that's important to note. And what's actually interesting is if you look at the vegan groups compared to the omnivorous groups, they found that there was less post-exercise fatigue and some interesting findings that way as well. So something to maybe further explore down the road.
And then the other interesting trial that came out that I think is also interesting here is often when those two clinical trials come up, and maybe Mark Hyman brought this up, people wonder again about elderly. So, okay, in young, healthy people who are really sensitive to protein and are doing resistance training, okay, that's one thing. Maybe there's not a difference between plant and animal protein. But what about in an elderly cohort? And that was actually something that I've been waiting for someone to kind of study this, and I still think there's some more studies to be done. But Luke Van Loon's group did a study this year that I found that was really interesting, where they did it was a 10-day controlled vegan diet, and it was a crossover trial. So you did 10 days. Have you seen this paper?
Yeah, I've seen it, but I might not know it in as much detail as you.
The long story short here was that there was 35 or 34 adults. They were around 72 years old, and they were healthy, active adults. So they were doing like 12,000 plus steps a day, but they weren't going through like, resistance training programs. So again, I think this was more representative of the typical 72-year-old. And so every one of these participants got to do 10 days on the two different diets, and they gave them 95% of their meals. So there was like 5% of their meals where they advised them on what snacks to kind of add in here and there, but otherwise all the food was provided. So they knew exactly what they were eating. And they were consuming about 1.2 to 1.3 grams of protein per kilogram. So it's not like they were jacking it up to a really high level where you run into that kind of issue or rebuttal that some people might say, okay, at that level, plant protein is as good as animal protein. So they had it down at more, again, at this kind of a little bit higher than maybe what people consume in the general population. And they were looking at daily muscle protein synthesis. And this is the important point, and I want people to go and read this paper because this was funded by the beef industry. And that's not to say this was a bad study. I think I've said this on other podcasts, like Luke Van Loon is known to do some really great study designs and is from all reports a really strong scientist. But I'm sure the Beef Checkoff program enjoyed that the hypothesis going into this, based on their previous research, which was done on a single meal, looking at single meal muscle protein synthesis, was that the omnivorous diet would be more anabolic. And so they ran this trial, and to their surprise, there was no significant differences in daily muscle protein synthesis in these 72-year-olds between the omnivorous diet and the vegan diet. And at the end of the paper, they say, now the next question is, in this cohort, if you were to carry that out and look at strength and look at muscle mass like those two studies you mentioned, do we see this kind of play out and find no significant effects at that kind of trial?
Yeah, and I would love to see that because I've spoken with like Hamilton Rochelle from who did the Brazilian study, and one of the problems they have with studying muscle and strength changes or gains in elderly populations is getting them to consume that optimal level of protein of like 1.6 grams per kilogram or higher. So that is reassuring, seeing those results at a lower level, but then carrying that out could also be further informative to see if there's differences there with muscle gains.
And an interesting point that they made in the paper, because I thought about that too, and I thought, were they giving them a lot of protein isolates to get to 1.2, 1.3? And in fact, they didn't use any protein isolate in that study. So they used soy-based dairy alternatives, and they used some plant-based meats. And again, you mentioned before there was that effect on fatigue in that other study. This study didn't look at that, but they actually found they were measuring satiety, like satisfaction post-meal. And they also looked at LDL, and LDL cholesterol was significantly lower on the vegan diet. And by the way, the omnivorous diet in this was not a standard Western diet. They did it according to the Dutch dietary guidelines. So they considered it a healthy omnivorous diet. It was high in fiber, not ultra processed. But the finding of appetite I thought was interesting, because when the subjects were consuming the vegan diet, they reported significantly greater satiety post-meal.
That's interesting. I mean, maybe some of the fiber or something of the sort. Perhaps. I mean, we do see a little bit of weight loss in some of the trials on plant-based meats, which might in some ways be owing to the at least modest amount of fiber that they can contain. So interesting.
So how do you wrap all of that up when someone says to you, okay, based on all of that, summarize it for me. Does the source of the protein that I'm consuming affect my adaptations that I get to exercise?
I'd say long story short, no. Really, at the end of the day, what matters is the amount of protein. The source seems to play little, if any, role, provided that you're having some level of variety. You know, if we were to repeat the same studies where you're getting all your protein from a single plant source, could you maybe make an argument that that might be suboptimal? Sure. But as long as you're having some level of variety and hitting around that range of, 1.2 or so, that's pretty good. And of course, if you're looking to absolutely maximize muscle and strength, going higher to 1.6 is reasonable. But beyond that, it seems to be no further benefit.
It is interesting to me that Peter Attia and Andrew Huberman and Rhonda Patrick, even Mark Hyman, are not speaking and sharing the results of these clinical trials that we've walked through. I've really never seen them discuss them at any length. And I'm also interested in a lot of these acute single meal muscle protein synthesis studies, which don't seem to be translating into the things that people really care about. I've always taken my recovery very seriously, and nothing has improved my sleep and energy like the Pod 5 Ultra from 8 Sleep. The Pod 5 Ultra is a high-tech mattress cover that you can easily add to your existing bed, enhancing your mattress with personalized temperature regulation, elevation, sound control, and sleep tracking, all without needing to wear a device. Research suggests the pod can increase deep sleep by up to 34%. Deep sleep is when your brain does its housekeeping, flushing out metabolic waste products, essentially preparing your brain for the next day, so you wake up feeling clearer and sharper. For me, that's exactly what the Pod 5 Ultra has done. It's been a huge part of helping me overcome debilitating insomnia, and now I wake up sharper without the dreaded heavy eyes and brain fog, considerably more energized for the day ahead. Head to 8sleep.com/theproof and use the code THEPROOF to get up to $700 off your very own Pod 5 Ultra. You get 30 days to try it risk-free, but I'm confident you'll love it. Shipping to many countries worldwide. Again, simply visit 8sleep.com/theproof today. When I was having this conversation with Mark, Dr. Hyman, on his show, his rebuttal to me, which when I listened back to it, I didn't think it was a strong rebuttal, was that, okay, there's been a couple of these clinical trials that have looked at strength and have looked at muscle mass, but then he pointed to a meta-analysis and said, what about all of these studies that have shown animal protein is more anabolic, or the Protage paper and it was kind of an appeal to authority. He said, there's a lot of scientists on here that are protein scientists, and in this paper they say that animal protein is more anabolic. What's to say that your science is better than this?
So I'll touch on the Protage first, because I think that's an easy one. Is for one, that was a sort of consensus paper with some experts like Stu Phillips back in 2013. That was before these studies that we've just talked about. And they don't really emphasize, an animal protein benefit over plant protein. There is sort of one little section where they mention there's some data supporting that, and they reference a narrative review by Stu Phillips, actually, where they talk about some of those acute muscle protein synthesis studies. Now, as you've noted, he's clearly changed his tune on this, and we've seen him talk a lot about how he's changed his tune on this at this point. So I wouldn't say that at this point is good evidence for that position. Now, as far as the other meta-analysis that he has cited, this was from, was it 2022 or something? I don't have it exactly up here, but somewhat recent meta-analysis where they looked at a bunch of different strength outcomes. They looked at different age groups. They looked at muscle mass, and they compared animal protein to plant protein, sort of. Now, in this meta-analysis, they did not only include protein match studies. So you could have studies where someone's consuming plant protein but a very low amount versus somebody who's consuming animal protein but a very high amount. One example of this, of a study that they included, was by actually Neil Bernard's group, where they had a low-fat vegan diet, and the people on that vegan diet were consuming 0.5 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight based on their final weight. So this is after they lost weight. The numbers would look worse if we used their initial weight. And the omnivores were consuming the RDA, so not even that much either, but clearly more. So you're taking a vegan diet where they're not even meeting the bare minimum of what's recommended versus an omnivorous diet that would at least be considered adequate by conventional standards. And that's just one example, but that goes to show that, yeah, they were not considering that in this study. So when we actually match protein, as we've discussed, there doesn't seem to be a difference. And beyond that, they weren't only including studies where there was resistance training. So there were studies where people were not doing the training, and we know that training plays the bulk of the role, and protein really seems to exhibit its benefits when combined with training. So there's a number of issues there, and I just wouldn't consider it good evidence.
And just to clarify, those two studies that I brought up, Luke Van Loon and the Nicholas Bird, the other beautiful thing about those studies were calories were matched and protein was matched, which is obviously super important. And just to kind of also double click on something, I alluded to the fact that daily muscle protein synthesis is probably better than single meal. Is that something that you've looked at or thought about?
It's something I've thought about a lot. I'm not sure of what data there is showing how that translates to outcomes. That'd actually be a good question for someone like Stu Phillips. But just generally speaking, when we look at these acute post-meal effects, they tend to wash out when we look at longer term effects for a number of different outcomes. Let's pick on the plant-based crowd for a second here. A lot of them will cite the short-term changes in endothelial function. So the ability of arteries to dilate after having a huge dose of oils. So let's put it in context here. And they'll often use that to suggest that, well, we should avoid all oils because they quote unquote cripple your arteries. Of course, again, huge dose, but these are just very temporary changes that occur after consuming those oils. Whereas when we look at long-term, we don't see a difference in endothelial function. And even longer term, we don't see a difference, we see a reduction in cardiovascular risk, right? So we have to look at the longer term outcomes generally. In the same way, if we look at exercise, during exercise and shortly thereafter, your inflammatory markers are up. You're in sort of a state of inflammation a lot of the times, especially if it's like vigorous intensity activity. But over the long term, it ends up being a good thing, right? So it's the same sort of concept, but I would like to see data seeing how that translates to outcomes, because I'm not sure exactly what there is on that.
Yeah, I've seen some papers where they're hypothesizing that maybe like after you eat a meal, an omnivorous meal, maybe you get a sharper rise in muscle protein synthesis, but then it comes back down sooner. Whereas with the plant protein rich meal, for whatever reasons, might not spike as quickly, but might stay up higher for longer. And it's not until you look across a full day that you kind of appreciate that total, I guess, area under the curve, right? And that I don't know if that is scientifically factual, and that explains why we're seeing no difference in those 10 and 12 week trials. Or explain, why we're seeing a difference in the daily muscle protein synthesis studies versus the single meal. But if that is true, then it casts a lot of doubt on a huge body of research that has been done over decades looking at what happens to muscle protein synthesis in the hours following a single meal.
So actually, that reminds me of another study, also funded by Beef Industry, that came out not too long ago, where they looked at soy-based burgers and beef burgers. And what's interesting here is they looked at a 4-ounce serving of each, and they fed these to individuals, and they measured their post-meal muscle protein synthesis. So again, that's short term. And they did find that in that case, the soy-based burger didn't stimulate muscle protein synthesis as much as the beef burger. But there's a number of issues with this. We've already talked about the problems with acute versus chronic. But another thing they did was in that soy-based burger, it actually had less protein than the beef burger. So it wasn't matched. They also looked at an 8-ounce serving of a soy-based burger compared to the 4-ounce beef burger, and they found that in that case, there was no difference. And so the conclusions that they sort of draw from that is that, oh, you need to consume twice as much soy or way more calories or twice as much of the soy-based burger. But with muscle protein synthesis, there's a threshold effect. And so what if it is the case that if you just match protein, you end up with the same result anyway? Again, this is just acute, so who really cares? But it's just interesting framing. And I want people to take this away here where, yes, this was a beef industry funded study. It's not flawed because it's beef industry funded, right? In fact, you talked about the Luc Van Loon study. It's just that you have to look at the methodology because sometimes there's some weird things going on like that where they will structure a study in a way that might favor certain outcomes, but I'm not going to dismiss a study on the basis of it being funded. Now, I don't know. I could be completely out to lunch. Maybe that had nothing to do with it.
Well, I think if they were here to kind of steelman that, they would say, well, actually, we were more interested from a generalizability point of view here of just comparing the standard beef burger you pick up off the shelf versus the standard soy burger.
Sure, but then you can pick a different type of plant-based burger, like the newest Beyond Burgers, which are much higher in protein. Right. I mean, there's so many different, and instead of a lean beef burger, you can use a standard beef burger. Like you can kind of cherry pick that any direction. So I do still think it's a little bit shady in the way that that's designed. But again, was that just coincidence? Was it poor design or was it intentional? I don't know. I'm not going to make accusations that way.
It wouldn't be the first time where you compare a food to a comparator that is pretty weak.
Yeah.
To make something look good.
Yeah, exactly.
But I guess just to before we move on to long-term health outcomes, it is interesting to me that, you know, Peter Attia and Andrew Huberman and Rhonda Patrick, even Mark Hyman, are not speaking and sharing the results of these clinical trials that we've walked through. I've really never seen them discuss them at any length. And I'm also interested in a lot of these acute single meal muscle protein synthesis studies, which don't seem to be translating into the things that people really care about.
Yeah, and I've seen that so much in this space. I mean, I'll bring up Lane Norton, my buddy Lane there, who, you know, very similarly, I remember when the Heavy Lorraine, that Brazilian study came out, it was months and months before he ever mentioned it. And he's somebody who I would view as maybe having a bit of an animal protein bias there. And it's just like, that's big news. I would take it as big news. Like, why would that not be, you know, forward facing? But it was a lot of pressure from people like maybe yourself, myself, others in the comment section asking for him to comment before it eventually got to that point. Yeah,
I think it's an unsexy, unfavorable study result at the end of the day, because there is an inherent bias in our society towards animal protein. So it's not the kind of study result that people necessarily want to hear. So there's that. But I also, to Lane's credit, I do think I think he's different to Peter and maybe Andrew, maybe Rhonda, in that he has since come out and said at these higher protein intakes at 1.6 grams per kilogram, there doesn't seem to be a difference between animal and plant protein, where I rarely hear Lane acknowledging the benefits of plant protein is when we look at chronic disease risk.
Yeah, I would, you've done a couple of videos on that.
So he gives lip service to the strength and the hypertrophy, but he doesn't speak to the fact, and guys, this is actually a great thing, because the way I see it is it's great news that plant protein can be just as anabolic as animal protein. Why? Because there's so much evidence suggesting that when you swap calories from animal protein for plant protein, you're reducing your risk of so many different chronic diseases that we would all rather avoid, right? So it seems like a win-win to me, but I've even seen Lane try and twist data like the Maximova study, which I know you've kind of double clicked on a number of times.
Many times, yeah.
But it seems that Lane is not prepared to support the statement that people would benefit from consuming less animal protein and more plant protein for these other outcomes outside of strength and outside of hypertrophy.
Yeah, one classic example of that will be the Maximova study, which you actually discussed with him on a podcast, if I recall. And this was a study out of Canada that he often references, where they looked at red meat intake, both processed and unprocessed, and cancer risk, but in the context of either low, moderate, or high fruit and vegetable intake. And basically, they found that if you're consuming plenty of fruits and vegetables, and I can't recall the exact number of servings there, that unprocessed red meat was not associated with a higher risk of cancer. But some issues that I would take with this, and I know you brought them up, is that for one, the high meat intake was less than a serving a day. It was maybe 500 grams a week or so. And usually when it comes to cancer risk, or at least colorectal cancer risk, we're looking at least 100 grams a day, or about 700 grams a week. So it was certainly falling south of that. Now, in addition to that, they pooled cancers together. So they looked at total cancer risk, and they looked at 15 cancers lumped together. And when we look at unprocessed red meat intake, it's most strongly associated with colorectal cancer and potentially associated with a few other cancers like pancreatic or prostate. And so it doesn't make sense to conclude that, there's no risk because it didn't increase your overall cancer risk, when it could have increased colorectal cancer risk, but because it didn't affect all these other cancers, you just don't really see a result there. Plus, you're eating a lot of fruits and vegetables, which might lower risks of other cancers. And so I don't like the framing there. Now, what I particularly dislike, where he goes beyond just the cancer discussion, is he often uses that to suggest that if you're eating plenty of fruits and vegetables, unprocessed red meat is not problematic, full stop. There's no discussion of cardiovascular risk. There's no discussion of all-cause mortality or other outcomes. So it doesn't make sense.
So there's two real big problems there, or three. One is this was specific to cancer, so let's not extrapolate it outside of cancer. Two, the subjects in this study were not consuming a lot of red meat. So let's not extrapolate that to red meat doesn't increase risk of cancer, because what dose are we talking about at all? And three, the strongest evidence for red meat associating with cancer, to your point, is colorectal cancer. And we might not be seeing that effect when you just lump in all other forms of cancer.
Exactly.
To that. So how do you interpret that study?
I mean, I don't think there's much to interpret, to be honest. It suggests that, look, at that level of intake, which is we'll say modest level of intake of unprocessed red meat, if you're eating plenty of fruits and vegetables, then your overall cancer risk does not seem to be higher than somebody who's eating a lower red meat diet, again, with plenty of fruits and vegetables. That is the takeaway. It doesn't tell us about specific cancers. It doesn't tell us about higher levels of intake, so a serving a day or more. And so and it doesn't tell us about heart disease risk or other outcomes. So it just needs to be interpreted in the way that it's presented, and that's exactly what it tells us.
And then, of course, I'm still waiting patiently for Lane to come back to me on that other study, and you know the one I'm talking about here.
The healthy aging study, yes, out of the Nurses' Health study. So this study was looking at something in the ballpark of 30 or 40,000 women in the Nurses' Health study, followed for nearly 3 decades. And they were looking at this sort of criteria that they made for what's considered healthy aging. So this was being free of 11 chronic diseases, being in good mental health, not having cognitive impairment, and not having impairments in physical function. So those 4 things. And they found that higher protein intake was associated with a greater odds of healthy aging. And so when Lane cites that, he's correct. However, he doesn't seem to emphasize how the results were different between plant protein and animal protein. So just to summarize really quick, a 3% increase as a percentage of calories in animal protein from non-dairy sources was associated with a 7% greater odds of healthy aging. From dairy sources, a 14% greater odds of healthy aging. However, from plant sources, 38% greater odds of healthy aging. So it's a massive difference.
And that detail, my memory of his video was that he sort of celebrated this. He did say plant protein did well, but he sort of celebrated this as just a win for protein overall.
And this is where compared to what? If you're comparing some of these animal protein sources, like, whether it's total animal protein or whether it's dairy animal protein to like refined grains, hyperpalatable, high calorie foods, sure, maybe there's a benefit there. But in their substitution analysis, plant protein beat out every single nutrient they looked at. So it beat out total carbohydrates. It beat out refined carbohydrates, unsurprisingly. It beat out carbohydrates from whole grain foods. It beat out total fat, saturated fat, polyunsaturated fat, monounsaturated fat, animal protein, and dairy protein.
Right.
Every single one.
And
it
was actually big. So if you looked at, and you probably have this in front of you, but I believe for a 3% of calorie substitution from animal protein for plant protein. So in that case, it's non-dairy animal protein. So it could be like red meat, swapping out for 3% of calories coming from protein from tofu, for example. It was almost a 40% higher odds of healthy aging.
Yeah, and let's put this in context. We're talking 3% of calories. So in a 2,000 calorie diet, that's 15 grams of protein. So swapping just 15 grams of protein from animal protein to plant protein leads to that substantial of a benefit. That's crazy.
And the other thing that I mentioned in my video to Lane was that healthy aging kind of outcome was a composite outcome. Like you mentioned, it included absence of chronic diseases, no impairment in memory, no physical function limitations, and good mental status. And there was a kind of second analysis in that paper after they looked at healthy aging. They looked at those individual kind of 4 outcomes. And plant protein, for every 3% of calories coming from plant protein, increased the odds of not having any physical function limitations by 41%. The same, it was significant for animal protein, but it was 5%. And I think if we're thinking about like frailty, that's what physical function limitations essentially points to. A lot of people have been led to believe that more animal protein, again, means less risk of frailty. But in this study, people that were consuming more plant protein, again, had significantly less risk of having any type of physical function limitations as they aged over that 30-year period. And then for mental status, the only protein that was associated with increased odds of having good mental status was plant protein. So total protein overall was not, animal protein was not, dairy protein was not, but every 3% of calories coming from plant protein increased the odds of the subject having good mental status by 16%.
Yeah, it's across the board, it seems like.
So, I mean, that was my major gripe when I did that kind of response to Lane. And I had thought that he might look at that and, come back and say, you know what, I presented this study as a win for total protein and including animal protein, when in fact, if you look more specifically at the results in this study, it suggests, specifically considering that in general public today, like 60 to 70% of calories from protein is coming from animal protein. So that's like the population we're speaking to here. And this paper to me makes a very compelling case for swapping calories, like you said, 15 grams of animal protein for plant protein, and you're getting these huge results, bearing in mind everything that we've said earlier in this conversation around the fact that that is not going to be a trade-off when it comes to your strength or muscle.
Yeah, and I think what's also worth noting about the nurses' health studies in particular, just to give some people some context, maybe if they aren't familiar, is that this wasn't kind of your typical observational study where they assess people's diet at baseline and then they follow them for 20, 30 years. They actually repeat those assessments every 2 to 4 years, whether on diet or other lifestyle factors. So if there's changes along the way, like they'll note that. It's not just a matter of, oh, this was your diet however many decades ago. They're following them up, and so it's pretty compelling data particularly when it comes to some of the best available observational epidemiology out there.
And just quickly, because I know some people will be thinking, yeah, but Matt, food frequency questionnaires, how do we know that even that questionnaire that is done every 2 to 4 years, which mind you is something that Walter Willett shared with us on an episode previously, who's pretty much the main author on all of these papers. How do we know that that survey is actually going to be good at telling us what these subjects are eating?
Because they validate them. So they'll take a smaller sample of participants, could be hundreds, could be thousands. I'd have to look at the specifics for this one. And they'll have them fill out those questionnaires, and they'll also have them track their diet over time. So they'll get oftentimes random, maybe the night before, they'll get notified, hey, you need to track your diet tomorrow, so that there isn't as much prep as far as changing your habits or what have you. And then they'll have them weigh out their food, perhaps take pictures of them depending on the study, and submit what they're eating on maybe several days throughout weeks or weekdays, several days on weekends over the course of a few months. And then they'll actually see how well does that correlate with what they reported on the food frequency questionnaire. And I think there's this misunderstanding with the questionnaires where people think that it asks you, hey, what did you have for breakfast 2 Saturdays ago at this time? That's not what they ask. They ask, over the course of the last period of time, whatever they're looking at, how often do you eat apples? Do you have one a day? Do you have two a day? Do you have a couple a week? Do you have one a week? Do you have maybe one or two a month, or none at all? And it doesn't need to be perfect. What we need these to pick up is that people who consume apples every day would hopefully report that they consume them far more often than people who never consume them or very infrequently consume them. And you want to separate those individuals. So it doesn't need to be perfect. It's unlikely that somebody who doesn't eat red meat, or at least maybe does once a month, is going to report consuming it every day versus somebody who actually consumes it every day. And actually, speaking from personal experience, I just participated in a validation study for a food frequency questionnaire. And so I filled out a few different types of surveys, and they were going to validate them. And I actually had, over the course of like 8 separate days spread out over, I think it was 3 weeks or a month or something like that, had to fill out, take pictures of my food, write out the ingredients, write out the amounts. Like it was pretty involved. And so I've sort of seen firsthand what that's like. And so they are getting a very accurate picture of what I'm actually eating. And then, of course, I'm filling out the questionnaire, and they're going to see how well they correlate.
Is it now better for that person to consume a diet that's low overall protein with that ratio, or high overall protein with that ratio? And what you're saying is that people who had the high plant to animal protein ratio in a diet that had more protein had lower risk of cardiovascular disease compared to subjects who had the same high plant to animal ratio but low protein.
Yes.
That'll shock a few people. When Dr. Will Bolsowitz and I set up 38 Terra, our goal was ambitious: to build the world's most trusted gut health supplement company. Today we're selling in Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, with the United Kingdom and Canada coming soon. And the truth is, Shopify has made this journey 1,000,000 times easier. It's simple to build and update our site, and with just one Shopify account, we can add different markets for different countries, localizing currency and pricing to improve our customer experience, and importantly, conversion rates. Our single Shopify store also seamlessly plugs into Amazon and multiple warehouses around the world, making it easy to ship efficiently to our customers, no matter where they live. So whether you're just starting out or scaling globally like we are, Shopify gives you the tools to make it happen. Turn those dreams into and give them the best shot at success with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.com/proof. This wasn't the first paper to do a substitution analysis, and I know you've spoken about these many times, even on this show. Before we get to those substitution analyses, because I want you to kind of just paint the picture as to what this body of literature has shown us over the last 10, 15 years, as that kind of substitution analysis kind of, I guess it was invented, became available, because prior to that, we hadn't really seen it, but then there's been like a whole slew of papers. But before we get to those, what is it that makes this particular paper unique, the healthy aging paper?
Well, I think for starters, the criteria for healthy aging makes it somewhat unique. Whereas a lot of the other substitution analyses out there are looking at a single outcome. So they'll look at like heart disease, they'll look at diabetes, they'll look at a specific type of cancer. And in this case, you're seeing I think what many people's goal would be, being free of all those chronic diseases, being physically able to function, et cetera. So that's one aspect that makes them unique. But then when it comes to substitution analyses, and what makes them so valuable is that you're actually looking at that compared to what question. When you look at studies comparing, say, I don't know, high fruit and vegetable intake, or we'll just pick one food, high vegetable intake versus low vegetable intake, you're essentially comparing vegetables to the average of their background diet. And in a Western population, that's often going to be a pretty crappy diet. So yeah, vegetables are going to look really good. And that's one of the arguments that people present. What's ironic about that is when you look at high red meat consumption versus the average background diet, red meat's still associated with worse outcomes. So you're sort of comparing to a not great diet to begin with, and red meat doesn't look so good. But in these studies, you can specifically compare the red meat or whatever food you're interested in to, say, plant protein sources or I mean, sometimes specific foods. And that's after adjusting oftentimes for fiber, for diet quality, for exercise habits, for socioeconomic status, for health status, and on and on and on, to make sure that you're balancing those individuals pretty well.
And what do we see from that body of research?
I mean, we see consistently across the board. There was a great systematic review titled something along the lines of isocaloric substitution and healthy aging, or it wasn't quite healthy aging, but some sort of aging title there, where they actually went through all of the literature on up until 2023 or 2024 on animal and plant protein substitutions. And for a number of outcomes, whether that's certain cancers, whether that's cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, certain weight outcomes, we see benefit with the plant protein.
Okay, so where we're up to so far, to kind of recap, is that we have explored how much protein seems to be optimal for muscle-related outcomes. And I would just say, to summarize that, we kind of landed on the 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram. We then explored the research looking at whether there is a difference between animal and plant protein for those muscle-specific outcomes. And we went through all the data suggesting that there doesn't seem to be a kind of superiority or extra anabolic benefit to animal protein, providing you're consuming these optimal levels of plant protein. A little bit more science perhaps to be conducted in elderly. We'd like to see some of those longer trials looking at strength and muscle mass. And now we're in the middle of the kind of chronic disease, longer term data. And so a question that kind of pops to my mind here that I think people will have is, if they're following this conversation so far, they might be nodding their head with you as you talk about the substitution analyses, that there is benefit to consuming more plant protein relative to animal protein. But then they've also come across this message that actually, from a chronic disease point of view, you don't want a high protein diet because protein increases risk of cancer. Protein, regardless of source, increases IGF-1, mTOR, blah, 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 right? Usually a lot of mechanisms come out here. There was a recent paper by Andrea Glenn. I know that you've looked at this in detail, and maybe we can start here and then introduce any other papers that you want to. But what was the significance of this new paper from Andrea Glenn's group, and what if any light does this kind of shed on this question of how much protein we should be consuming?
Yeah, they did an excellent job here. I've actually spoken with her about this, and I've got some details that they're actually working on follow-ups to this, looking at other outcomes, which I think will be really interesting. But in this particular study, they used the Nurses Health Study data, but they also looked at Nurses Health Study 2 and the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study. So just health professionals across the US, doctors and nurses, and about 200,000 people followed for about 30 years. So again, very, very long follow-up. And not only did they look at the ratio of plant to animal protein, so a higher ratio of plant to animal versus a lower ratio of plant to animal, they also looked at the protein density of the diets, so a higher protein diet versus a lower protein diet. And I have a few of the outcomes here. Now, in a low protein density diet, increasing the ratio of plant to animal protein was associated with a 15% lower risk of cardiovascular disease.
Say that again.
So in a low protein density diet, so a lower protein diet, to be clear, this wasn't that low. We're talking like 1 or 1.1 grams per kilogram, but like around that kind of middling area.
And as a percentage of calories, we're talking like
15.8.
15%. Okay.
Yeah, of calories. But a high plant to animal protein ratio was associated with a 15% lower risk of cardiovascular disease. But then they looked at a high protein density diet, so 20.8% of calories, so quite a bit higher. A high protein to animal protein ratio was associated with a 28% lower risk of cardiovascular disease. And both of those were compared to a low protein density and a low plant to animal ratio. So if you weren't consuming a lot of protein and it was mostly from animals, compared to a high protein diet with a bigger emphasis on plant protein, that led to the best outcomes.
Okay, let me repeat that back to you and see if this lands, or actually see if this landed with me. So in that paper, subjects who consumed more plant protein relative to animal protein, so a higher plant to animal protein ratio, had lower risk of cardiovascular disease.
Yes.
That was the outcome.
Yeah.
Okay. But then if we think about that, that's just a ratio. So you could have high plant to animal protein ratio in different diets, a low protein overall diet and a higher protein overall diet. Okay. So now we're asking the question of, okay, if we have high plant to animal protein ratio, and we know that there's some cardiovascular benefit up for grabs there.
Yeah.
Is it now better for that person to consume a diet that's low overall protein with that ratio, or high overall protein with that ratio? And what you're saying is that people who had the high plant to animal protein ratio in a diet that had more protein had lower risk of cardiovascular disease compared to subjects who had the same high plant to animal ratio but low protein.
Yes.
That, I think, that'll shock a few people.
Yeah, and they did very comprehensive adjustments for things like diet quality as well. So it's not the case that the low protein diet was just some really poor diet. They ultimately had a pretty high diet quality across the board, or at least they adjusted for that factor.
And the reason I say that I think that will shock people is that there is a fairly consistent and strong message among certain kind of plant-based doctors that have been in the space for a very long time that protein is not something that you need to consider. It's not something that you need to plan meals around. Certainly not something that you need to track. And if you just eat a plant-based diet, you will naturally consume enough protein. And in fact, increasing that amount of protein could be harmful, even if it's coming from plants. That seems to be a message that I've certainly heard. And I know that you had a debate recently pretty much on that very point.
Yeah, so that was with Dr. Neil Bernard, and I was actually pleasantly surprised. He said very explicitly that if your protein is coming from plants, you can't get too much as far as outcomes. I actually thought he was going to have a different position on that, but no, it seems like he's actually come around, and he's one of the people who maybe previously held the position that lower protein was better. And unless I don't want to misrepresent him, maybe I'm off there, but I believe that was his position prior.
I think Dr. Greger's position is that lower protein's better.
I think because of IGF-1 in particular. Yeah.
So what would you say to someone who has come across that information? Here's what you're saying about the Andrew Glenn paper, but also has come across, someone talking about just protein in general, increasing IGF-1, whether it's Dr. Greger or Volta Longo, and is worried that increasing protein, even if it's coming from black beans or tofu or tempeh, could be accelerating aging and increasing their risk of developing cancer or some other form of chronic disease.
Well, let's touch on IGF-1 for a second here. So the concerns with IGF-1 is that high IGF-1 might be associated with poorer outcomes in cancer. Right? We can grant that. But the increases in IGF-1 that lead to those outcomes are massive. So if we look at Mendelian randomization studies, so these are looking at studies where people have genetically higher or lower IGF-1 levels. An increase, and I got the numbers here, about 44 nanograms per milliliter increase in IGF-1 is associated with about a 10% greater odds of certain cancers.
Is that just in like a Word doc or?
Yeah, this was I'd prepped this for when I was talking with Dr. Bernard.
This is why we bring you in. Ladies and gentlemen, I've not come across anyone who's as prepared as this guy.
I feel like there's some stuff I haven't fully prepared for this, but anyways, happened to catch me on something that I was prepared for. But so this is what's interesting. 44 nanograms per milliliter increase in Mendelian randomization studies associated with a 10% increase in certain cancers like colorectal, breast, prostate. But guess how much protein interventions on average increase IGF-1?
Marginal.
0.4 nanograms per milliliter. And the largest, so 44 associated with higher risk, protein interventions increased by 0.4. Okay,
I've never heard anyone comment on that.
Yeah, see that this is I think a really compelling point. But let's go further. The highest IGF-1 spikes that you see are in milk protein interventions for some reason. The exact reasons why I don't know. It might have to do with the amino acid profile. Even that is about 13.8 nanograms per milliliter. So it's much larger, but still well below where we actually see an increase in these Mendelian randomization studies. So on the surface, it doesn't make sense at all to be concerned around the IGF-1 increases that we see with protein interventions, especially non-milk protein interventions. And then we can look at the long-term health outcomes. Again, plant proteins associated with good outcomes pretty much across the board. We can look at substitution analyses, again, comparing plant protein sources to animal protein sources and colorectal cancer risk. But I mean, that's a cancer where we know that certain animal proteins are not doing so well. So to add to the notes on cancer, actually, there is the 2020 meta-analysis by Nagishi, or I can never pronounce their name right. I'm sure I just absolutely butchered that. But protein intake, whether from plant or animal, was not associated with cancer mortality risk. So that's one piece of evidence. And then, as I'd mentioned, we do see the substitution of animal for plant being beneficial.
So the amusing part of all of this for me is that while that might be a slightly contentious point or something that, say, Dr. Greger and you and I are not in alignment with, Dr. Greger perhaps being concerned about protein and our position being as you've kind of just walked through. I think Peter Attia, on the other hand, would completely agree with that, that the IGF-1 story is a little silly. But at the same time, I think he would hear everything that we've just discussed in the last 20 minutes about substitution analyses and the benefits of swapping 3% of calories from animal protein for plant protein with respect to reduction in risk of chronic disease, healthy aging, these sorts of things. And I think he would have some problems with that. And he would probably push back and say, these studies that Matt and Simon are presenting are long-term observational studies. These are not controlled trials, and they're heavily confounded. And what Matt and Simon are not telling you is that the people who are eating more plant protein in these analyses are also doing other things. They are generally healthy people who follow the guidelines, which means they move their bodies more, they drink less alcohol, they smoke less, they're healthier body weight, they meditate more, they have less stress in their life, all of these things. And for that reason, the risk reduction we're seeing is probably from all of these other things, not from the consumption of tofu.
So there's a couple problems with that mentality. For one, I think there's a bit of hypocrisy there, if he were to say that, because he often cites exercise literature. And the exercise literature that we have on actual cardiovascular outcomes or mortality outcomes is observational, and it's often self-reported. And actually, self-report for exercise is comparable or even worse than self-report for diet when we look at more objective measures.
So on that, you're saying the same problem exists in that in those studies that he cites to say exercise are good because of VO2 max or whatever, cardiorespiratory fitness, the people who exercise more are also doing all of those things more that I just mentioned.
Yeah, and the self-reporting, the accuracy of the self-reporting of exercise is not really any better than the self-reporting of diet. If anything, it might even be worse in some cases. And so those criticisms don't fly. Now, he also cites a lot of cardiorespiratory fitness studies and uses that as a proxy for exercise, but there are potentially some issues there too. For one, response to exercise when it comes to cardiorespiratory fitness is, at least to a large degree, determined by genetics as well. So that plays a role. It's not just purely exercise. They also almost never account for diet quality, almost never. And so some of that benefit could be due to, again, healthier diet habits and people with higher CRF and people.
When you say they don't account for diet quality, Explain that to someone who's not familiar with this.
Yeah. So, like, for example, if we look at the studies that we've cited on nutrition here, or plant protein, animal protein, they will also track people's exercise habits. Now, some of them might be just looking at, how many hours do you do per week, or some might go further and actually look at the intensity of exercise and track that to some degree. The types of activities, they might ask specifics, like which sports do you play, and then they'll categorize that into different intensities. So the level of depth they go into does vary, but then they adjust for that variable to make it, we'll say, overly simplified, because this isn't exactly how it's done. It's sort of like you're comparing people with, say, higher or lower plant protein, but who exercise about the same amount. Like, that's essentially the end goal there. Way oversimplification. But I'm saying the reverse isn't always true. So when you look at a lot of the exercise literature, especially the cardiorespiratory fitness literature, they don't often account for diet. They don't track diet quality in the same way and then level that out. So people who are more active or who have a higher cardiorespiratory fitness are probably also eating healthier. And that's not accounted for. So how much of that benefit is due to that issue?
Whereas if you want to use these studies, these observational studies, to understand the independent effect of exercise, you would want to do your best to adjust so that you're comparing people that exercise a lot versus people that barely exercise, where the diet is similar.
Yes, exactly. And I will also go a little bit further, and I think this is a huge problem in general with people who criticize observational studies because of confounding. When you mention a confounder, like, let's say I brought up one of these studies on nutrition, and someone like Peter Attia or whoever was to say, oh, but they didn't adjust for, I don't know, you mentioned meditation. Let's just throw something out there. Okay, they didn't adjust for that. My question would be, how do you know that meditation impacts the outcome? Right? So by saying something is a confounding variable, you're saying it causes the outcome. It's associated with the exposure, plant protein in this case, but it causes the outcome. Now, meditation's maybe a silly example, but let's go with exercise again. You have to have evidence then that meets your threshold for cause and effect that suggests that exercise causes a reduction in cardiovascular disease. What evidence is that? It's observational epidemiology. And so that's your threshold for cause and effect. You can say the same thing about smoking. You can say the same thing about, of course, socioeconomic status. How are you going to do a randomized controlled trial looking at that, even though it's one of the greatest predictors of mortality? You can go down the list. And so confounding is a causal concept. If you're going to say X is confounding the relationship, you're saying it causes the outcome. And what's your evidence for that? Right? So you can sort of push back on the individual.
So if you were sitting down with Peter and having this conversation around protein, what would be the main question or questions you would have for him?
My primary question, especially if it is pushback on the observational literature, would be, what is different about the exercise literature that makes you accept that as cause and effect, or potentially cause and effect, that doesn't apply to the diet literature?
I think he might say the effect size.
But the effect size isn't that different. If you actually look, if you're looking at an individual food, maybe that's a small
3% of calories.
Yeah. But if you're looking at overall diet quality, it's pretty comparable to those exercising more or less in most studies. Like, even the same cohorts, if you look at the Nurses Health Study or Health Professionals Follow-Up Studies, yeah, you might get a 20, 25, 30% reduction in some of these outcomes with greater exercise. But it's not like you're cutting risk it down to a quarter or, something crazy like that.
Okay, so we, at this point, have worked through 4 of our 5 questions. How much protein is optimal for building muscle strength and preventing sarcopenia? Is animal protein superior to plant protein for muscle and strength? Is plant protein better for healthy aging and chronic disease risk reduction? Is a low or high protein diet better for longevity and disease prevention? And the final question, which is outside of our primary area of expertise, but I think it's worth touching on, and we can refer people to other resources to read more, is plant protein, as stipulated by pretty much every government guideline now around the world, better for the environment?
I would say yes, based on not only speaking with you, but our good friend Nicholas Carter, who I would definitely defer to. But also, if we look at like Our World in Data, they have some excellent resources from Hannah Ritchie, who I believe you've had on, right? I think
and even more recently, I had her on. She's been on 2 or 3 times. I think the first 2 conversations were mostly food focused, and the latest one had 10 or 20 minutes on food.
Okay. So, I mean, there is compelling data there, but like you said, it's a little bit outside of my particular area of expertise. But something I will mention is as we just had the Eat Lancet 2.0 released, just about a week prior to that, actually, before I get into that, maybe I'll highlight what the Eat Lancet is. It's the so-called planetary health diet. This was a diet predominantly plant-based, not exclusive, but limited amounts of animal foods that was designed to meet our climate goals and to improve human health. And they had a huge group of researchers. I believe Walter Willett was on there and a number of others. And they released the first one back in, I want to say 2019 or so. And then they just had 2.0 released a matter of weeks ago. Now, just before that release, Changing Markets Foundation released a report looking at the pushback against that first iteration from 5-6 years ago. And they really showcased how much pushback there is on this and how there's coordinated efforts by meat industry in particular, and how they've positioned certain scientists as sort of experts in their favor, how they've coordinated campaigns with big name influencers, some of whom we've certainly responded to on social media. And so this is something that I think is going to be as social media continues to expand, more and more of an issue moving forward, and certainly creeps into the nutrition space as well. It's not just about the environment.
No, and one of the interesting narratives that I saw was this kind of rhetoric that animal protein and meat is important for food sovereignty. And so, we all care about food sovereignty. But of course, there were a lot of people that were led to believe that they needed to champion the farming of animal protein because, in fact, that was better for food security. But if you just keep an open mind and you look at that research on how the farming production of plant protein affects the planet compared to animal protein, whichever way you chop it, no matter whether you look at grass-fed beef or you look at intensive factory-farmed animal protein, plant protein, essentially across the board, produces significantly less greenhouse gas emissions, whether you look on a per kilogram or a per gram of protein basis. In the ballpark of 30 times less greenhouse gas emissions if you compare a food like tofu to beef on a per gram of protein basis. And I think most importantly, and often left out of this conversation, is how much less land is required. So it's around 50 to 100 times less land used to grow a gram of protein from peas or tofu or any other legume compared to beef or lamb. And Hannah Ritchie often states that, and this is not the goal of the Eat Lancet planetary health diet, but if the entire world was to shift to a plant-exclusive diet, again, not the goal of that paper, we would be able to use 75% less land for agriculture and significantly improve food security. So if you are kind of putting the stake in the ground over this issue of food sovereignty, then the scientific position is to be promoting a shift from animal protein to plant protein. And that's what I found, that sort of coordinated media push, backlash on the Eat Lancet, framed it as the opposite.
Yeah.
Framed it as governments and food corporations want this shift to plant-based for profits, and it's going to shift control to big companies away from the individual.
Yeah, I find that framing so odd, especially when they're talking about like industry and that, because it's literally an industry with or making that pushback, right? It's the meat industry. So it's sort of ironic in a lot of ways.
And when I just sit here as someone that's interested in looking at this objectively, take a 1,000-foot view of everything that we've discussed now. This is why I can sometimes get worked up if I listen to a podcast, some of the podcasts we've mentioned, is that the responsible scientific position here, when you look at all of that research, for me seems to be, let's recommend people consume an optimal amount of protein. Yes, above 0.8 grams per kilogram. Let's get people up to that 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. And then let's have a bias to plant protein, because it's clear that that's going to reduce their risk of chronic disease. It's going to lead to a healthier planet, which all of us rely on. And it's frustrating to see that kind of continue to be ignored in these conversations.
Yeah, and I found, what was sort of funny about going back to the changing markets report, they sort of highlighted all of these strategies that are used by industry and by the influencers and all of that. And then in response to that report, they literally did exactly what the report said they would do. They blame, big anti-meat as if that's some kind of industry. They retweeted people who were at the top of, in the report, the retweet list as far as like who gets shared the most. Like they were literally just reinforcing the results of that report, which I thought was really funny. But you're totally right that it doesn't even need to be all or nothing. It's literally just a shift. And that's maybe one of the things that I found also interesting about the Eat Lancet is I made some posts on this, a collaboration post with some people, and I would have a lot of vegans pushing back, but like, why are they recommending any amount of meat? They aren't recommending it. They're saying up to a certain amount is okay because it meets their threshold for the environment. And so it's almost like you're getting pulled in all sorts of different directions as far as like it's anti-meat, but then, it's not vegan enough. It's like, well, how do you make everybody happy? You don't.
And I think some people listening will be wondering, okay, well, if I eat according to that planetary health diet, and we'll put the link to that into the show notes, is it possible to do that in a way that gets me to 1.2, 1.3 grams of protein and fulfills all of my micronutrient needs? Because that's certainly one of the pushbacks I've seen from some folks online, is that, okay, this could be better for the planet, but is it going to lead to more deficiencies?
Well, for one, they do account for nutrient content in there. I found that a lot of the pushback when people present that sort of argument, they're really taking like the least favorable idea of this diet. If it recommends X amount of whole grains, they'll pick like the least nutritious whole grain, that sort of thing. But there are plenty of ways to get a ton of nutrition through that sort of diet, as long as you're following it with maybe some thought, as any diet requires to meet your nutrient needs. Also, I wouldn't rule out the benefits of perhaps a multivitamin or something for many people, or increased fortification. I'm all about that.
Do you take a multi?
Yeah, I used to actually just individually supplement like B12 and vitamin D and stuff, and now I just take a multi.
I take a multi.
Yeah, it makes it easy.
Yeah.
Don't have to think about it. So
right. And then that covers iodine,
yeah,
and vitamin D and selenium and zinc, and
yeah.
And
even if you don't need it, it's like
right.
as long as it's not a crazy dose, it's
I do DHA and EPA with that as a separate supplement.
As a separate, yeah. It's not in most multis.
Are you doing that?
I do very occasionally, not usually.
And protein wise, and I'll put this into the show notes, but it's within that dietary pattern, it's super easy to hit 1.3 grams per kilogram. Even like for someone who, let's say, is eating 2,000 calories a day or 2,200, totally possible within that. It could be completely plant exclusive, or it could be plant predominant with foods like fatty fish and Greek yogurt and stuff, and maybe a few eggs. But it's not that if you adopt this plant-rich style dietary pattern as outlined in the Eat Lancet paper, that you're not going to be able to consume an optimal amount of protein, or that you would have to consume too many calories. That's not the case.
No, not at all. Again, in order to really make it look bad, I think you have to try. That's why I think a lot of individuals who are pushing back in that way were designing pretty poor diets.
What's your view these days on choline and supplementing with choline or the consumption of eggs?
It's a good question, because I have a paper in review right now that I authored with David Goldman on this topic. I don't know, maybe it'll be out before this episode, we'll see. But yeah, so choline is an essential nutrient, but its needs vary depending on a number of other factors. So for example, if you get betaine, which is more prevalent in a lot of plant foods, that actually accounts for some of your choline needs. So how much choline do you really need? depends on these other variables. The second is, are you familiar with where the adequate intakes for choline came from?
Liver studies? Were they liver studies?
Looking at liver-related outcomes, yeah. So, I mean, primarily studies done in the 90s. So the adequate intakes are quite high currently. I believe it was 550 milligrams for adult men, 425 for women. And it's an adequate intake, not a recommended dietary allowance. This is something to understand. Adequate intakes are intakes that we know are sufficient, but it's not necessarily where we know the line should be drawn. It's more of just like a conservative estimate. And that's because a lot of it came from this single study done back in the 90s where they had a high choline diet with, 500 some odd milligrams of choline versus a low choline diet, which had like 50 or so milligrams. And they found that low choline diet was inadequate and people ran into liver issues, and the high choline diet was adequate. Now, they use that to suggest, our target should be around that 500.
I'm surprised that was never followed up with 100, 200, 300.
It should have been. Yeah, it's very odd. But so we know that, okay, this is enough and this is not enough, but where should the line be drawn? Now, the reason I bring that up is if we look at the average intakes in American populations, it's well below the RDA on average. Yet deficiency, or at least diagnosed or overt choline deficiency, is extremely rare. It's not something that you really typically see.
How do they are they diagnosing that through some type of liver complication, or
that's usually one of the signs would be a liver related disease, and then you'd have to diagnose it as choline. So it also could be an issue of maybe not testing enough for that, but hard to say.
So is there a risk if someone was like thinking, okay, well, in the absence of that evidence, maybe I'll supplement with 300 milligrams of choline a day or 200 milligrams?
I don't see any clear risk for that. Also, I will note that where we do see some benefit and where I think it is warranted is through pregnancy. Particularly, I believe it was second and third trimester, where we see the most clear benefit. I mean, I would just do it all the way through. I wouldn't, think too much about it otherwise. But in pregnancy, there does seem to be some benefit for cognitive outcomes in the infant. But other than that, evidence isn't super clear. That said, you can certainly get choline from plant foods. A lot of soy foods, certain cruciferous vegetables, Brussels sprouts. You have certain types of legumes like lentils. These can all provide a decent amount. Quinoa would be actually a grain with a fair amount. So it's not impossible to get a decent amount, but it's not something that I would overly stress about.
Was your review focused on choline or also on eggs and health outcomes?
It was choline specifically. So we didn't dive too much into like eggs and health outcomes. Now we can talk about that. That's a whole can of worms. But specifically choline.
Well, let's go there. Let's go there. If someone is thinking, okay, planetary health diet, plant-rich diet, and they're contemplating the inclusion or exclusion of eggs, and if they're including it, how many eggs is healthy? What does the science that you've looked at, and what is that science that would help answer that question?
So I want to first just mention that a really good short review that people should read on this was by Deirdre Tobias. I will send it to you. I'm sure you've already read it, actually.
I have, yeah.
I think it's super well done, and she hits the main points.
What was
here.
the title? It was a funny title.
It was Unscrambling, or was it Unscrambling the Egg something? Or I can't even remember.
It was a play on words.
Yeah, it was definitely a play on words. But anyways, there's a few factors you need to consider: the dose and what it's compared to. So you'll see, especially the American Egg Board loves to cite studies out of Asian populations in particular, where egg intake is generally much lower than out here in the West. And so they'll cite one study out of China where high egg consumption was like roughly half an egg a day or so, and then low egg consumption was like an egg a week or something. I might be off on those numbers, but it's a small difference between high and low, and high wasn't all that high. Now, in that case, yeah, they didn't see an increase in risk of cardiovascular outcomes. Egg intake's also associated with socioeconomic status there, and that wasn't super well controlled for or adjusted for. But that aside, when we actually look at larger contrasts in egg intake, so like an egg a day versus very rare consumption, we see very consistently the eggs increase the risk of cardiovascular disease. Now, this is where some more of the nuance comes in, because you have to look at comparisons. So if we go back to substitution analyses, you see that replacing eggs with plant protein associated with lower risk of cardiovascular disease. Replacing eggs with meat actually increases risk. So meat is worse.
Why do you think the replacement of eggs with plant protein would result in a risk reduction?
So there's a couple possible explanations. One is an increase in the phytochemicals that you get in the plants. They often adjust for fiber in these analyses, so that won't really bias the results too much. But also the dietary cholesterol, to a degree, in the eggs does seem to impact our serum cholesterol and LDL cholesterol, and further down,
more
ApoB.
so in a diet that doesn't have a lot of baseline cholesterol.
Yes,
Because
exactly.
where I'm getting at with this is like if someone's thinking about the Eat Lancet and they're thinking with or without eggs, they're already consuming a diet that's kind of low dietary cholesterol. So the addition of eggs would have a significant, some effect on their serum cholesterol and ApoB.
Exactly. And we actually have randomized controlled trials. There was a meta-analysis by Sikarudi or something. Again, I'm bad with these names. But this was a meta-analysis, 60 some odd RCTs. And they did find an increase in ApoB with egg consumption versus even egg whites. And that's a really good comparison. If you want to study the impact of eggs in the context of an RCT, that's the way to do it, whole eggs versus egg whites. And they did see an increase. Now, as you mentioned, if that's due mostly to dietary cholesterol, well, the impact of dietary cholesterol depends to a degree on genetics, but also on your baseline intake. So
what was it that you're bringing me back to Dr. Dayspring's lectures? I think it's the AB.
Oh, the gene.
ABCG5
something.
receptor.
Something gene. We need Boopy, our buddy Boopy there to he'll know. But
G5G8. It's the G5G8 receptor that affects your cholesterol absorption.
Yeah, so there's that, and we see stark differences in cholesterol
or was it
absorption.
Niemann-Pick C1 like one?
I don't know.
We'll have to
going
go
down
back to that episode.
Too many rabbit holes here. Yeah. But anyway, so there's that. But then also, if you don't eat any dietary cholesterol, if you consume a plant-exclusive diet and you add eggs, you'll likely see a larger rise. If you eat a more Western diet that's loaded with cholesterol and you add eggs, you probably won't see much of a change at all.
Okay, so I'm going to put you on the spot here.
Okay.
So let's say someone's eating the Eat Lancet dietary health, kind of planetary health diet, which I believe they've modeled out in some observational studies and shown that if you adhere to that style of eating, there's significant reductions in cardiovascular disease and some other chronic diseases. But if someone's eating that style of dietary pattern and they have eggs, let's say they have some salmon, it's probably within the guidelines, and maybe they have some Greek yogurt, and their fiber's high, phytochemical consumption is high, and their ApoB and LDL cholesterol looks good. Is there an advantage to reducing animal protein further?
I would say we don't have good evidence to support that, provided when you say LDL/ApoB is good, if you mean optimal. Right?
I mean good according to us. So,
okay, okay.
Let's say it's between 50 and 70.
Okay, then in that case, I would say there isn't good evidence. If we actually look at a paper by Zong looking at, I think it was 6 different U.S. cohorts, they looked at egg consumption and cardiovascular disease and mortality, and again, they had a pretty wide contrast in intakes, but they did a subgroup analysis where they looked at those with LDL cholesterol under 70 milligrams per deciliter or above that. And under 70, mind you, confidence intervals were wide, so there's a caveat that this data wasn't super precise because not a lot of people have LDLs that low. But in that case, the point estimate was actually quite low. So it's not clear that there would be an effect really at all with eggs in that case. If there is, maybe a very small effect. So I would say that there is data supporting that probably not a big deal in that sort of context.
But to your point, I do wonder how many people can get below 70 with that style of diet.
Yeah,
I think some people probably can that are kind of genetically blessed, but then I think for others, they God damn it. Whereas others like me, have to remove like literally everything, and my LDL is still hovering like 70s and even high 70s. So that's going to come down to the individual kind of playing around and seeing how their body responds.
Yeah, like these are the types of things I think we can really look at when it comes to this idea of like precision nutrition, whereas I think a lot of what's talked about out there is very sort of lackluster when it comes to, data. I mean, these are the types of conversations we can really have.
How's that protein shake going over there?
It was good. It's collected a little bit at the bottom once I finished the milk, so I might have
I think that this cup creates an issue where there's far too much protein powder for water.
It was a small. I was expecting a larger cup, so maybe that's why.
But that brings me to kind of where I would like to finish this conversation. And this week it's been very topical in mainstream media, across social media. There's been a lot of, I'd say, fear generated over the consumption of protein powder, in particular plant proteins, with respect to heavy metal content. I know you've looked at this. As we've already gone through, you can achieve 1.2, 1.3 grams per kilogram, even 1.6 grams per kilogram, to be honest, within the context of a healthy dietary pattern. As you get up to the higher end there, at least in my experience, I do believe it is made easier with a plant protein isolate. And that's certainly what I do most days. And I think a lot of other people are kind of in a similar boat where they'll supplement their healthy diet with 30, 40 grams of a protein isolate each day. It's convenient, it's low calorie, and it just makes it much easier to consistently get your protein into that optimal range. However, these news reports have kind of generated a lot of fear among consumers, and they're worried, well, if I'm consuming that 30 or 40 grams every day from protein, particularly plant protein, am I unnecessarily exposing myself to heavy metals that bioaccumulate and could be increasing my risk of disease? And I'm talking about metals like lead and cadmium and arsenic. I've done a video on this. You've done a video on this. Give us your kind of overall understanding of how this news story came to be and what your take-home message would be to the listener who's currently trying to work out, should I keep consuming plant protein isolates or not?
Yeah, this was one of those things that I don't know how many times I got sent. Once in a while something comes out, they're like, everybody's sending me, all day for 5 days straight. And so it was a huge story. And so this was a Consumer Reports article where they basically sampled 2 to 3 samples of, 23 different protein powders or drinks or ready-made protein drinks. And they assessed for like lead and other heavy metals. Lead was the main one that seemed to catch most of the headlines. Now they, based on their level of concern or their cutoff, found that 16 of them exceeded that cutoff for lead and 2 of them were over 10 times that. So quite high. However, we have to look at what is this cutoff. Now, they use the cutoff of 0.5 micrograms of lead per serving, which was based on the California Prop 65 law, where it requires labeling if you meet certain thresholds. And they chose that because it was the most conservative cutoff. However, we have to look at like, well, what risk does that mean that someone has if they go over that? And so where that cutoff came from was they looked at the highest lead content that has not been shown to lead to birth defects or reproductive harm. And
the highest lead content that has not been shown. So keyword not.
Yes.
Highest lead content that has not been shown to lead to reproductive harm.
Or birth defects, yes.
Or birth defects.
And then they divided by 1,000. Okay.
It's a huge safety buffer.
Yeah, it's a massive safety buffer. And so even if, let's say you took the proteins with the highest content that were, 10 times or so this cutoff, you're still 100 times lower than the level that wouldn't have been shown to cause that harm. Now, to kind of showcase how conservative these numbers are, if we look at the FDA's numbers, they have 8.8 micrograms per day for women of childbearing age and 2.2 micrograms per day for children. That also has a 10 times safety factor built in, at least, okay?
Suggesting that 80 odd micrograms a day has not been shown to be toxic.
Yes. Yeah. And then if we look at Europe's number, now I extrapolated their numbers to like a 30-gram scoop of protein because it's like per kilogram. So a 30-gram scoop of protein powder would be allowed to contain 90 micrograms of lead. Think about how different that is.
0.5 micrograms is the Prop 65 level.
Yeah.
Or 90 micrograms, so 180 times higher.
Yes. And about 10 times higher than the 8.8. Again, they built in a 10 times safety buffer, right? So so that shows how low the cutoff was for that report and how there is some variety in those sorts of cutoffs that are used. Now, to also add to this, we get lead in our food. We are always consuming some level of lead. I'm not saying, hey, go for it, but lead is natural. It's in our soil, it's in our water. It's going to make its way into our food, whether that's animal foods or plant foods, and to varying degrees in different types of food. And based on the total diet study by the FDA, where they sample multiple samples of foods over several years, and then look at the lead content, you find lead contents that would exceed the Consumer Reports cutoff in virtually every food group.
This was the most disappointing thing for me.
Yeah.
It was like, okay, guys, if we're going to create fear over a serve of protein based on it having a microgram of lead or half a microgram of lead, then we're going to have to do the same thing for an apple, for a cup of rice, for a punnet of strawberries. And what's that going to do to the anxiety levels of the everyday person?
Yeah, I know it's creating undue fear, and actually they did something similar, if I recall. I haven't looked at this specifically, but I've seen some credible people mention it, so I'm assuming that it's been done. But they did a similar analysis on like baby food, and think about how much that would scare people, right? Like that's pretty terrible in my view, because I think that would really scare people away from or scare people into not knowing how to feed their babies potentially.
The one thing that I do like about this conversation is that it is shining light on the fact that the supplement industry is underregulated compared to pharmaceutical industry or other industries, and it is a bit of a free for all. And so there's certainly this trend online where brands are getting put under the microscope because even content creators have worked out that, I can go and buy a few of these off the shelf and spend $1,200 and send it to Eurofins, which is a laboratory, or certified labs. There's a bunch of them. But as long as I'm willing to pay, I can have this analyzed to know exactly what's in it. And so I'm not sure if you caught it, but a couple months ago, there was a big story where a bunch of creatine gummy brands.
No, I didn't.
They were tested. And it turned out to be true. It was repeated. They sent multiple batches of multiple brands, some of the top sellers on Amazon. And they either contained no creatine or very little. And the rationale for that is not that creatine monohydrate is a very expensive ingredient, but it's chalky and it doesn't taste great. You can make gummies that taste way better and get far better reviews by just not putting creatine in the product.
That's hilarious.
Right? And of course, that let a lot of consumers down. And in that case, it's not that someone's buying something and being exposed to a potential adverse effect, but they're not getting the claimed efficacy. So they're wasting their money. So this light is being shown on the industry of, hey, greater transparency is needed. And now like NSF certification for sport, which you've seen. So you can go and do that as a brand. And that means every single batch is going to be sent to an organization that's a third party. And that's why the MLB and the NBA and the PGA are recommending their athletes use this, because every batch will be tested as it comes out of whatever facility for banned substances and heavy metal and microbiology and microplastics and all of these things. And it keeps the brands accountable, and it makes sure that the consumer is protected from an efficacy and from a safety point of view. So I think that part of the conversation which seems like I'm agreeing with you. I don't like the unnecessary fear and anxiety over exceeding thresholds that seem to be arbitrary and extremely conservative. They're not actually safety. It's not the Prop 65 at the end of the day is not a safety threshold. And that part of this conversation seemed to be completely left out.
Yeah, and I think something that they did with framing in that report that I really didn't like was, if you look at the actual figures that they made, it just showed the percent. Like how many percent are you over the 0.5 micrograms versus like, look, if you're at 1 microgram, it's 100% higher, or 2% or 200% of the value or something like that. And that sounds a lot scarier than, you're 0.5 micrograms above the whatever their cutoff was, right? So there's a lot of, I think, framing issues with the way that it was presented. But again, yeah, I'm all for better regulation. I often look for like NSF or consumer lab reporting on different supplements. I think those are good things, but we have to look at that in context. Like, what do these numbers actually mean? Are they really of that much concern? Are they not? All else held equal, sure, go for the one with less lead. But it's just, I don't know why we're singling out protein powders here over everything else.
All right, land the plane here. What are the main kind of most important points you think from the things that we've chatted about today? And what are the questions that remain open or future studies that you'd like to see on protein?
So, I mean, I think first and foremost, aiming for about 1.2, you could even go maybe a little under that 1.1 grams per kilogram or so, is a really good target for the general population and for aging individuals. If you want to squeeze out every last drop of your muscle and strength gains, yes, go up to 1.6 grams per kilogram, but no, you don't need to aim for 2.5 or anything crazy like that. There does not appear to be a difference between animal and plant protein when it comes to these outcomes, and the limited data we have in elderly populations suggests similar, but that is an area where, as we've talked about, it'd be nice to have a longer term study in elderly individuals with like a moderate protein intake, like 1.2, 1.3 grams, and seeing where that goes. But when it comes to health outcomes, and this is what I know you and I care about, I think a lot of people listening to this will care about, plant protein clearly comes out on top of most animal protein sources. I think you could have debate around things like fish or certain dairy products. Maybe it's more of a equivalent swap in some cases. But plant protein is king in most cases, and I would recommend biasing your protein intake towards that. And then, of course, for the environment, as you mentioned, and again, not necessarily my area of expertise, but that is something to consider as well, because we only have one planet, so let's keep it around for years to come. And I think that kind of wraps up most of what we talked about, unless I missed anything there.
No, beautiful. Well, thank you, as always, for being the encyclopedia that you are. And
I just got my notes. I don't usually have that.
Right. You're always welcome to come back and hang out anytime.
Will do.
There you have it, friends. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did and want to stay up to date with future episodes, be sure to hit that subscribe button on YouTube and follow on Apple or Spotify. Finally, thank you for showing up and the effort that you're making to take control of your health. I look forward to hanging out with you again in the next episode.